So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this session today. This is session 5 a.m. And we have got Dave Clitheroe, who's gonna talk about GDPS, what's new. Throughout the session, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to raise them in the chat box, and Dave will try and answer them as he goes along. So Dave, thank you very much for presenting today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Rui, and welcome everybody. Thankfully, it's not 5 a.m., it's 9 a.m., which is slightly more civilized. And it's so nice to be able to present to you without a thumping head at 9 o'clock in the morning during the conference. And being virtual does have its advantages, I guess. So this is a session we regularly hold during the GSE conference and other conferences to describe kind of what we've been doing in the land of GDPS, what's been brought into the solution in the last year or so, really. I mean, we say what's new, sometimes I give a release number, but we're delivering more and more in a continuous delivery model, even though we have a new release each year. So the service stream does get a number of updates for small programming enhancements as we go throughout the year. So without further ado, let's crack on. If I can manage to advance the slides without one at a time. Just a quick advert. Don't forget the raffle. Obviously, there won't be people coming around at the dinner with buckets for you to buy your raffle tickets, but dig deep and give to these two very worthy causes to get your name in the hat for the raffle prizes, as per usual with GSE, lifeboats and I can't remember what is it? Guide Dogs for the Blind. Very, very, very worthy causes. If, by the way, there is some strange noises in the background from me, it's probably my dogs. They're just behind the door behind me, and they can sometimes get a bit twitchy when people go past the house and let loose with some interesting noises, but hopefully they'll keep quiet while we're presenting. Okay, so what's new in GDPS? The current release made available in March of this year was 4.4. We do support our N and N-1 coexistence as per has been the norm for GDPS. The only change from that really was 3.14 to 4.1, where we changed the code base so significantly that we were unable to support coexistence, and we had this slightly strange migration method available, but we're beyond that now, and we will continue to do N and N-1 coexistence. But there's the health warning. We don't test running it for 6 months in coexistence mode. We test it, we make sure that everything appears to work, and then we move on and upgrade everything to the current release. So we do not recommend that you plan to run for long periods of time in a mixed release, because the level of testing performed over a long period just isn't there as would be for a single release level environment. And don't forget to check the PSP information to get the latest and greatest information, because sometimes we do find there's special installation instructions that have to be made available to you via that method. Another thing that's new this year, and for those of you who are downloading the code, you'll probably be pleased to hear that we are no longer shipping a copy of the WebSphere Liberty profile, because that is now made available in every generally available ZOS release. We decided we don't need to ship it anymore, so you are now expected to use the WebSphere Liberty profile that comes with your ZOS, ZOS, I should say, in order to exploit both the GDPS GUI and the RESTful API, and more on those as we go through the session. Another key migration consideration, if you are a GM2 site environment, and this is only applicable to GM2 site, is that we have changed GDPS GM in the 2-site configuration to use the XML-based disk configuration. Now, some of you may have GDPS MGM as well as just GDPS GM, and you would have found it a little strange that in MGM we did support XML, and in the two-site environment we didn't. Now the XML configuration is common throughout all flavors of GDPS Metro, GM, and MGM, or Metro Global with GM. The only environment where we have not migrated to the XML configuration, and we will not be doing so, is XRC. There's a slide later on about XRC, and we'll make it clear as to why we're not doing that. There is one small restriction on GM two-site configurations, and that's at GA. The support for fixed block devices in the GeoPalm was not available in time, and the SPE that will be released later this year is currently undergoing test and should be made available shortly. So if you have fixed block, or you need to have fixed block devices in your GM configuration, that will be coming along soon. Okay, what's next? So now let's go into our potpourri, a number of slides with an awful lot of text on them. I will not be reading every line of text, but I'll be talking more generically about the various features that are described there and trying to put them in context. Following these kind of summary charts, there is a number of specific items that I've kind of picked out, which I describe as the highlights of the release, and we will go into those in a little bit more detail. So if I kind of skip something that you might think is important, it's probably because I'm going to come back to it later in the presentation. I mean, I won't skip it completely, but I'll give it a brief introduction only. All right, so GDPS Metro. I always start with GDPS Metro because, firstly, it is the solution that most clients have got. So more than 50% of all GDPS licenses that have ever been sold have been GDPS Metro, and it continues to be kind of the number one solution from that perspective. And also, it's kind of the what I talk about from a GDPS Metro perspective, because the code base for all the other flavors is shared. A lot of the talking is done on one solution, and it kind of says, and GM gets this too, and XRC gets this too in some cases. And so it's really just these are the main things, and some are Metro specific, but many of them are actually common to the other flavors of GDPS as well. And it probably comes as no surprise that I start the list with the LCP enhancements. Cyber resiliency is a hot topic. I am sure that has not escaped anybody's notice. Day by day almost, and certainly week by week, there is a notification of new breaches or ransomware attacks or clients around the world, be that government, cities, hospitals, health services, commercial clients, or whoever, getting some form of cyber attack, be it ransomware or malware or so on, causing them grief and generally costing a lot of time, effort, and money in order to resolve it. So LCP is a major focus item for us. We had a session yesterday that Terry O'Connor delivered, discussing in more detail than I will here some of these LCP enhancements that have been made. But just from a very quick perspective, we have introduced the capability to have multiple recovery copy sets. This was a very early requirement put on us by a UK-based client, and we've delivered on that. We've also provided support for some of the new microcode enhancements that have come around with safeguarded copy. So in 9.1, there was the dynamic virtual capacity backup volume expansion. So we now support that in GDPS, and you can track and see where the expansion is at and what the gating captures may well be that are preventing from that expanded area to be used, and you can see if that's something you can expire captures that are sat there gating the use. The 9.2 microcode release, and this isn't on these charts because it's not yet generally available, but Terry talked about it yesterday, and I'm going to mention it here. The 9.2 release brought in the incremental restore to production capability within the microcode on the DS8000, And that support is coming into GDPS this month. We plan to release it later this month. It's currently, it's pretty much gone through test. It's just going through some final iterations to make sure that it's as bulletproof as we can make it. And this allows you to incrementally restore from a safeguarded backup into a production environment, thus avoiding having to do a full push or a full copy of data back to get a captured backup into production, which is good news for everybody. There's another little line item here called persistent safeguarded backup recovery. This enables you to capture, or once you've captured a backup, you can recover it and you can keep it and keep the relationship alive. So GDPS knows that you have recovered that safeguarded backup, even if you've done a full copy to the recovery copy volume. It used to be the case that that relationship was then dropped. We now maintain that relationship that you don't, so you don't accidentally withdraw it, or you don't accidentally copy over it. So if you're doing some testing for some reason or whatever, you are somewhat protected where you were not necessarily as protected before. And the last bullet here is around the IBM Z Cyber Vault solution. So GDPS is a fundamental component of the overall Cyber Vault solution. I haven't got a Cyber Vault specific chart here, but it's a combination of hardware, software, and services to enable you to implement a cyber resiliency solution for the mainframe at some preferential terms and conditions, I will call it. I'm not going to discuss the commercials here, but there are some terms and conditions which make it, let's say, less costly than it might otherwise be. So that's it for LCP for now. We will come back to that topic in due course when we go into some of the items in a little bit more detail. A couple of releases ago in 4.2, we brought out the XML definitions for GDPS options, or GeoPlex options as they were then, and the script definitions. And it didn't take clients very long to ask for greater flexibility. And the flexibility requested is essentially the ability to concatenate multiple members for your script definitions. Having them all in one member made it cumbersome for some people and awkward, because they had some scripts that were common across, particularly if you've got multiple GDPS environments. They have some scripts that are very much common across all environments and some that are environmental specific. So to make life easier for them, and for any other reason you can think of, we now allow a concatenation of script definitions within the GeoDef DD statement. The first statement still has to be GeoPlex, or the GDPS options statement. That does not support concatenation, but any statements that follow it will be your script definitions. There is a new takeover script. With the dawn of 4.1, you may have noticed, and indeed I may have spoken previously about the fact that takeovers scripts had effectively been deprecated within GDPS. And that's true for the ones that tried to get a bit too clever for themselves and, based on the failure, suggest what script you wanted to run from a list of scripts. And that was basically a little bit, the logic in there was somewhat flawed. However, swap site scripts have continued to exist, so that you can automatically trigger just by the existence of the script some automatic processing following an unplanned hyperswap. And we have had requests for similar autonomic, let's say, capabilities following a processor failure, and the ability to automatically add capacity to other processes in the environment to take over the workload that would have been running on a KEC that's now been stopped for whatever reason. And so we have introduced another takeover script. This takeover script has a specific name, and it has and is triggered when a potential processor failure scenario has been detected. And the name for that script is quite simply kecfail_CPC name. And that script, if it exists, again, will be automatically driven in the event that a processor failure has been detected. And how do we detect whether a KEC failure has occurred? Well, quite simply, if a system fails and we are unable to talk to the BCPII, therefore the KEC is unresponsive from our perspective, the assumption is that KEC has failed. Therefore, we will trigger this script. Okay, it's fairly simple logic, but it's not totally without merit. And if you want to use that capability, all you have to do is code the script. In that script, I would suggest you're going to have some CPU or OOCOD statements or the capacity script statement in order to grow the capacity, but you don't have to necessarily leave your stop being innovative. You could have a user proc that does all sorts of funky processing if you need to do different things, different times a day, and things of that nature. So you could call a user proc from within this script to do any specific processing that you may need to do. Another enhancement is the Sysplex and IPL script statements. These changed, I think it was in 4.3, it might have been 4.2, I don't remember. But we've changed them a little more. We've enhanced them further, basically, such that the grouping of systems together, you can now have a target operand, and that target operand allows you to define the state or where that LPAR is currently, that system is currently operating. And it gives you greater flexibility again to filter a list of systems based on where they're running and what state they're in for your script statements to process. Something that has been talked about for a very long time, and something that's caused a number of issues, I guess, over the years, is the need to convert all hardware reserves in a hyperswap capable environment. And the good news is that hardware reserves can now be tolerated on primary PPRC volumes. And the logic is now there both in the disk subsystem and GDPS to ensure that the reserve will be transferred to the new primary post hyperswap. So you will not lose serialization on the resource that was being protected by that reserve. Now, what does that mean in reality? It does not mean that you can remove your pattern RNL, which converts all reserves. But what it does mean is that you can tolerate having reserves in the environment through the use of the exclusion list. So that can give some people a greater deal of flexibility for their environment, and it may simplify some exits that you might have that enable coexistence with other products. So that has been introduced in 4.4. I think it is also rolled back to 4.3, because I think that came in via an APAR on 4.3. There have, as usual, been a number of reliability, availability, and serviceability, or RAS enhancements. One of those is automatic unboxing of secondary devices during a hyperswap prepare, so you don't have to do that separately. Another one is the XCF message processing for internal variable transfer. It's a bit in the weeds, but it does mean that we have a greater reliability for our XCF message processing between systems in a GDPS Metro Sysplex, which is good news. And the third one that I highlight here is one of the key functions that we've optimized is start secondary. So the start secondary process has been further optimized, and the aim here was to both reduce CPU and the memory utilization. Yeah, it's a bit scary. I've noticed I've been frozen in time as well. I don't know why. I think it's a Zoom thing. I'm still here. I'm still alive, honest. Hopefully you can still hear me all right. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Martin, for confirming that. All right. So Start Secondary has got less resource intense, which is good news for everybody, I think. A small item, but quite nice, I think, is that in the GDPS panels, both the GUI and the 3270 interface, you were able to see a DS8000 microcode information about the disk control units in your environment. That, however, was fairly static and would only ever get refreshed during a config operation. Now, config operations aren't necessarily things you're doing every day. Therefore, well, neither are microcode upgrades from that perspective, but why would we force you to do a GDPS config for a microcode upgrade in order to get the right information? Seemed a bit of a restriction. So we've now got a simple refresh option on the panel under, I think it's option 31, the disk subsystem panel in the 3270 and somewhere on the GUI. I'll admit I'm a laggard. I'm one of these, I would say grey haired, but it's kind of no haired people these days. And you can go in and refresh that information by querying the control unit and storing that information afresh for your environment. Something else that came out 4.3 with the latest IBM Z announcements is support for the T02, so the baby Z15, and also exploitation of System Recovery Boost. When System Recovery Boost first came out, it was around starting and shutting. So IPLs would create a boost window, and stopping systems would create a boost window. So they stopped quicker and they IPL'd and got the systems running faster. But the more recent enhancements are around hyperswap, for example. So a hyperswap will now drive a boost window to ensure that any queues of work that may have occurred during hyperswap processing can be cleared as quickly as possible by having that boost made available. And we are actively looking at other enhancements, and I would not be so surprised to see, for example, the config process being able to initiate a boost window as well. So we're continuing to work with the IBM Z team, and indeed, for those who are interested, the GDPS team is now reporting into IBM Z. The move from GTS has been completed, and today is a memorable day, of course, because today is the day Kyndryl, which was GTS in effect, becomes its own publicly traded company. So until today, it was still a subsidiary of IBM, but now it's fully floated in its own right. And so the GTS team and Kyndryl are now a separate entity, but GDPS is remaining, or has remained, in IBM, and we're fully reporting to the IBM Z line. Another change we've made, and the GDPS CPC operators are now mandatory. Now, it was always a little strange to me, at any rate, and nobody in development could ever give me a really straight answer why we not only had N+1 CPC operators that had to be defined, but also that you didn't really have to have them, but it made sense to do so. And obviously, if you only had one defined, it would have serialized some things that could have been done in parallel. But that has become more and more important because these CPC operators are used for a number of things, including QHA processing. So query host access to understand who's got access to the GDPS managed disk and things of that nature. And so it came to the point where people who did not have the necessary definitions were running into some issues. And the only way to resolve it, quite simply, was to make sure they had the right definitions. And so we've made it a mandatory requirement to have the N+1 CPC operators defined, where N+1 is the number of KECs defined in your SA policy, +1. And they have to be defined in your security or the OPF member from a NetView perspective, if you're still using the OPF member. But they will be dynamically allocated through SA using the dynamic operator support in SA. So you only have to define one in the operator member in the SA policy. And that's used as a model to define the others. So we go out, find out how many KECs are defined in the policy under the processor option, and we will automatically start up that number +1 operators. So you need to have the right appropriate NetView and SAF definitions. Otherwise, GDPS initialization will fail. So it's it's quite an important one to make sure you've got right. There's a particular command here that's been reintroduced. The GDPS chug storage very much overlapped with the GDPS chug zdisk command. They had slightly different uses a while back, but now there's a common use, and basically we will deprecate the zdisk option or the zdisk command, and it will now be done under the GDPS chug storage command. If you are a heavy user of that, then be aware. Thanks to some of the GDPS Design Council members and their requirements, we have enhanced the BCPII exploitation, particularly went around suspension and resumption of sessions down to the support element. I'm not going to go into detail. It's a little bit in the weeds, but rather than having to do it, multiple places, you can now do it. It will happen automatically. It would not be a new release of GDPS without some health check extensions, and this release is no different. So there is a health check extension. In particular, possibly the most interesting one is the alert forwarding for SDF alerts. So if you have health check exceptions, rather than them sitting somewhere in the health checker and you're having to go into the health check panels and so on, or looking at it through SDSF, you can now create an SDF alert and have that alert forwarded to wherever you need that alert forwarded to, by simply tagging the message ID for that exception in your GOHCP member, and it will automatically create an SDF alert for that message when that exception occurs. As I say, some existing checks have been enhanced slightly. I'm not going to go into the details, and I can't recall. I think there may be a chart later as to a little bit more detail on them. But really, it's the SDF alert forwarding is probably the big ticket item here. There is a little known symbol available for GDPS users, and it's called AMPA GDPS mode, which enables you to, in some solutions, do quite a lot, but in most solutions do a little. And one of the things it can do, for example, is it can tell GDPS Metro, by setting that symbol to the value of no_DASD, to initialize without a config defined and without it spitting out a whole load of error messages because it thinks it should be managing your replication. So this enables you to bring up GDPS without a disk configuration loaded. And I would say it's probably used either for limited testing capabilities or some other specific use where you need to not have a PPRC configuration loaded for some period of time. Some minor, I guess another RAS enhancement really, first failure data capture for data during Linux, and also some of the commands going back into the net log on the K system rather than being stuck in some Unix file in the Linux proxies, which are providing the controlling system function in the ZVM Linux XDR world. So that's again, it just makes life a little bit easier, and we're continuing to enhance that as well. I think in the next release, you can expect more of this type of activity coming along. Support for certificates isn't particularly exciting, but it is there, and we're looking at ways of improving the renewal of these certificates. And again, that's something that's been actively looked at. But another new item in 4.4, and possibly as significant as many of the others, is a version 2 of the GDPS RESTful API. I have got a chart on it later, but I'm going to briefly mention now what version 2 of the API is delivering is greater consistency. We have not been very consistent in the way that we coded the API the first time round. We've taken a reflection on that and decided that we needed to make things more consistent, to provide an easier programming model, for want of a better phrase, to enable exploitation of the RESTful API. And that has been done in version 2. Now, the good news is version 1 API calls are still supported. It's not like you have to migrate everything to version 2 if you've done extensive coding and exploitation of the API, but it's something you may want to look at in order to make your life easier going forward and in the future. Okay, so that's the kind of the whirlwind tour of what's in GDPS Metro. Now let's try and put this and other things into context for the other GDPS solutions. Okay, and I still seem to be, I have moved, I think, slightly. I think it's kind of like every now and again it takes a new snapshot.
Yeah, you've moved, Dave, but your slides are moving. That's the important thing.
It's really quite strange. All right, so GM and MGM highlights. As I mentioned right at the start, the XML support is now there for the GM2 site configuration. There is a tool available to enable you to migrate a GeoMPalm into the new XML GeoPalm format. Excuse me, and that seems to work reasonably well. And there have been a number of clients use it, and a number of fixes provided where some controls hadn't been fully taken into account, but that's now, I think, working nicely. But more importantly, there is some UCB constraint release, both for GDPS GM and MGM. The first one is we now support the use of no UCB flash copy for the GM journals or the GMFC devices. So they do not have to take device numbers in your configuration anymore. And secondly, and very specifically for MGM 4-site customers, which typically they have more copies of disk, being 4-site rather than 3-site or 2-site, and therefore are more constrained for consecutive addresses. And we now support the use of alternate subchannel set 1 for the PPRC secondary devices. That wasn't done previously, or wasn't available previously, but it is now, which is good news for anybody who's got MGM 4-site configurations and if they've got particularly large ones. The oddity there was that in an MGM 3-site, we did support the PPRC secondaries in MSS1, but it wasn't there in MGM 4-site. GDPS GM and the MGM X, well, no, not, and the MGM virtual isolation LCP environments also pick up the same support that the I described on the previous chart for Metro, in that they have the multiple recovery copy sets and so on. And we have formally introduced support not only for the GM 2-site and 3-site virtual isolation topologies, but also for the GM 2-site external or physical isolation topology is also supported for LCP now. GM and MGM environments pick up the script enhancements for concatenation. They get the microcode bundle information, and they also pick up the other items mentioned here, such as the mandatory operators, the BCPII enhancement, health checks, not so much the specific health checks, but they get the SDF alert forwarding capability and the enhancements for the IVP for the remote health checks. We've introduced support for the virtual IDAA or the DB2 Analytics Accelerator, running in a secure service container. for MGM Foresight. We introduced it for 3Sight initially, and then Foresight required a new level of the virtual IDAA, and that was made available kind of back end of last year, probably about this time last year. That was made available and obviously fully blessed in 4.4. And there's also been an enhancement for the or an extension to the procedure handler for both MGM 3Sight and MGM Foresight, in that we provide an exception check report. And this check report or exception check report basically goes out and finds information out about the different GDPS environments in your solution. So that could be your Metro environment, your GM environment, or your 2 Metro environments in your GM environment, and ensures that all the various partners that are going to be required to communicate to carry out the procedures in that configuration are running at appropriate levels. We have had some instances where maybe GM hadn't been updated, or Metro had, or the other way around, where incompatibilities had crept into the environment, causing clients to have some grief during procedure execution. So this is kind of, if you're planning to run any procedures for specific reconfiguration activities, and you want it and you need it to work well, it is well worth investing the time to do to run the exception check report ahead of doing the actual procedure itself. So it's a kind of health check, basically, to make sure that you're in a good shape. And the GDPS GUI has been extended for MGM at long last. So initially you could just use it in the Metro environment, but now you can have it in the full MGM support. And also the RESTful API is released as well. The GUI was an SPE rather than a GA, but it's there, so that's good news. XRC and MZGM highlights. Firstly, we have provided one enhancement to XRC script processing in 4.4, but as the slide goes on to say, that is kind of it now. We have functionally stabilized GDPS XRC and as a result MZGM, basically because our good friends in Tucson have concluded that XRC is at end of life. The DS8900 range of disk subsystems are the last to support XRC. And we've also now heard from ZOS that the follow-on release to 2.5 will also not support XRC. We will continue to support XRC as long as it is supported by the hardware and operating system software. I think that makes sense for us to do that, but we have functionally stabilized it so that we're not we're using our resources in the most effective way, and those resources are being used to ensure that GM and MGM have the capabilities that XRC has, where there were some gaps previously. So the script processing that we have enhanced is all around grouping of copy ones or individual SDMs so that they could be acted upon in parallel. Okay, so rather than targeting a master session when things did happen in parallel anyway, this allows for that similar level of parallelism to be introduced through a grouping system, and it's user defined in terms of what you consider to be within that group. But those basically, it gives you that capability to group systems together and process commands against a group of SDMs in one single script statement. You define it on the session statement in the GeoXPalm, and as there's a list there of all the various XRC commands that are supported using the SDM group capability. But although we have functionally stabilized GDPS XRC, that is essentially with respect to the ZOS global mirror functionality. GDPS XRC does share the code base with GDPS Metro and GDPS GM and GDPS CA for that matter. So it will inherit a number of new capabilities coming into GDPS in general, and they are such as the script definition concatenation, the microcode bundle information, the mandatory operators are required, and so on. So it's not the end of the road for GDPS XRC. It will continue to pick up new common functions. It's just that we are not looking at bringing in new function specifically around the management of XRC itself. Okay, so that's that. And I did mention briefly GDPS CA on the previous slide, and it will be no surprise that GDPS CA has some enhancements. GA was planned for the end of 2Q and was delivered on time. We have reversioned it so it aligns with the existing GDPS solutions, because it was a little bit strange that GDPS CA was at 2.3, yet GDPS was at 4.3, and it caused some people to get a little confused, particularly those who've got both. And so we've now reversioned it at 4.4. So that they now align with the other solutions. From a functionality perspective, however, it's been quite a busy time. We have introduced support for a user exit that Multi-Site Workload Lifeline has introduced. That user exit allows clients to define your own routing controls, let's say, within the workload lifeline routing algorithm. And that can be used either to replace or as additional input to the existing processes for workload routing, which will typically be availability of servers and things of that nature. It does pick up the concatenation support, and that concatenation support for on GeoDef is not only for the script definitions in CA, but also for the workload definitions, because that was another area that it gave people greater flexibility. And from a database exploitation perspective or a workload exploitation perspective, there have been a number of enhancements in that space. So we now support the global consistency group characteristic or capability for workloads in IMS, which is similar to the multiple consistency group definitions in DB2, so it allows you to combine multiple replication subscriptions to be managed within a single workload. We do support now having multiple database management subsystems within a single workload. Now, it does allow you to have IMS and DB2. It doesn't allow you to have two DB2 environments within a single workload. So it's definitely across both. But be aware, there is no consistency magic here. Yes, they are managed, and they're managed within a single workload, but we're not cross-checking any multi-phase commit across different databases and things of that nature. And the IMS workload switching has been enhanced to support the capability that IMS has introduced to allow the fencing of data as part of a switch. It used to be the case that IMS, unlike DB2, which allowed the read and replicate status to fence the data from updates, that wasn't there for IMS, so you had to be a bit more careful in ensuring that stray updates didn't land in the standby site. Well, that has now been resolved, and there is a sort of a fencing mechanism within IMS now, which the GDPS routing switch capability fully supports. Okay, so that's kind of the highlight through all of the kind of things that have changed. Now let's spend a little bit more time on one or two of the new functions, and we'll start with LCP because it is kind of the hottest topic. And as I said, we now support multiple recovery copy sets. There was an RFE for this from clients, and it allows you to have up to 11 recovery copy sets or flash copy sets in your environment, and obviously the one safeguarded copy set in that sense. I mean, you have multiple safeguarded copy sets, but they are different disk volumes. One volume cannot be part of multiple safeguarded copy relationships, but the same volume can be part of multiple flash copy relationships, which allows us to have multiple flash copy sets and recovery copy sets, and the total is a maximum of 11 of both, or 10 of any one sort. And this gives you great flexibility if you, for example, want to do some data validation on one copy, and you maybe want to back another copy off to tape, and who knows, you might have a reason for a third copy as well. And I know some clients have looked at using multiple recovery copy sets for different, let's say, capture characteristics for disks. So some disks are being captured on a less frequent basis than others, and it allows you to put both into recovery at once and make sure that they are still coherent as a complete set of disks and things of that nature. So a good enhancement to have introduced. And also, I mentioned the dynamic volume expansion support. The way the expansion works, you can either listen to Terry's recording or hear my shambolic attempt to replicate it here. But basically, if you go into the DS8000 and through the dialogues on the DS8000, expand the virtual capacity for a volume, GDPS will detect that using monitor 3, and it will then track the progress of that volume expansion based on the situation for these gating backups. And Terry went through through the whole process of how this works. But basically, you get a nice report during the net log as part of monitor 3, and it will tell you whether or not there are volumes that are currently expanding and whether or not they are still being gated. Okay, and so that's it gives you eyes on a process that otherwise would seem a little bit strange, I think. You also get the ability within the profile. You can now look at the backup option again, and you get the statistics for each volume in the profile, and you get information about the storage pool that volume is defined in, the source capacity, the backup multiplier, the current percentage utilization of that as well. So you can keep an eye on things here very quickly and easily, and you can filter, the filtering capabilities, and you can sort these columns as well if you wish to be able to just quickly sort which is the highest percent used and see if you need to take any action against those. So a combination of the ability to expand and the ability to track through the GDPS panels gives you a much better instrumentation than was there before for this safeguarded copy environment. You can list all the backups again, and it gives you basically as much information as you want, I think. And if you find you need more or different information, let us know. We can change this as well. But it gives you, as I say, the utilization, and these flags give you some status as to whether or not you're fully provisioned or space efficient, or whether you're in the process of expanding, and whether or not you're in recovery and so on. So again, lots of instrumentation has been introduced in 4.3 and 4.4, and I think we may have even rolled some of this back to 4.2 as well. Okay, you can query a volume, and again, you get far more information than you used to do in terms of the status of the source volume, the safeguarded backup capacity again, and it gives you again flags as to whether or not this backup has expired, for instance, whether it's gating a recovery or gating an expansion. And it's also, there's a new flag been introduced here, which is the backup has been prepared for this incremental restore function that I mentioned is coming later this month to allow you to do an incremental restore back to production in the event of a corruption event being detected. Now, obviously, if every scrap of data has been updated by this corruption, then it will, in effect, be a full a full restore rather than an incremental one. But on the in the case where it is not a full, but you still need to go back in time to a consistent point and restore everything back to that point in time, this will dramatically reduce the amount of data that needs to be copied back. Okay, right, next one, the script concatenation. This is not the most complex to understand, but as I said, you can now have multiple data sets concatenated on that geodef DD statement. The health checks, to spend a moment here, the check config has been enhanced in that we now will detect an exception if you are continuing to use the default for the channel path recovery definition, which is a path scope of device. The recommendation is to change that to path scope of control unit. And if you are still using device, you will get an exception raised for that. The cases LPAR check has been updated to further refined, I think is the best way to adapt to the new ZOS recommendation of 8 gig of minimum for a ZOS LPAR, and also the CAN-Z log definition. So as you may know, you've got the tiny DS for the data space option in to control the size of the data space for CAN-Z log. But basically, to make sure that we weren't saying you've got a problem when you didn't have a problem, we've refined it now that we only do this check if you've got less than the 8 gig recommended memory size, which some of you may well still have because the LPAR continues to run fine, but you could get into difficulty if NetView was grabbing 2 gig of that for its data space for the CAN-Z log. So that tiny DS check is only introduced or only used when you've got less than 8 gig of memory defined. The check XCF is updated to identify where the CFRM message-based manager is running, and if it's running on a GDPS controlling system, it will issue an exception if there is a production system currently running as well, because obviously if there is only controlling systems up, it will end up on a controlling system. But if you've shut down your production systems for some reason, maybe you're moving everything off to the other site and doing a rolling IPL of systems, and the message-based manager ends up on a controlling system, you may want to know it to get to move that back to a production system where it's got more horsepower, perhaps, excuse me, than on a GDPS controlling system, which may not have the same level of provision of resources. And some information there on how you may choose to move that capability within the Sysplex. And the check report is updated to highlight which message IDs you have defined to create this SDF alert that I mentioned earlier. And this SDF alert is a very simple definition in that in your GeoHCP member, all you need to do is specify the WTO_2 SDF, fairly self-explanatory what that means. And then you specify the exception ID, so it's the back end of the message ID, and doing that with or without spaces. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. I suspect it's without a space. I don't know why there's one crept in there on the slide. Then you will get an SDF raised, and the color will be based on the whether it's an e-message, an iMessage, or so on. So you can then have that forwarded to whatever environment you need. Okay, health checks. Not only were the changes to the health checks, but also there is some minor panel flow enhancements in that you now have, when you go into the H option from the main menu, you're not launched straight into the health checks itself. You actually now have to navigate through another panel. Some may see that as a backward step, but it gives us greater capability to put more options into that rather than cluttering the main menu more. So you can launch the health checks on that system or look at remote system health checks, and indeed from within here launch the GDPS installation verification program, which will check your XDR or GUI definitions for you. So it's kind of combining all of that health check IVP type information into one place. The disk controller bundle refresh, there is now a refresh bundle option on the panel. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. But I will spend a minute on this RESTful API. As I said, it's simplification, it's also standardization, and to follow API REST best practices. For those of you who haven't yet tinkered with this, there is when you set up the GUI and the REST API environment, or even just the REST API environment, you get a web URL that you can call, and it launches a page very similar to this, whereby you can very simply practice and understand what data is returned by the REST API. And indeed, it gives you the programming snippet of the command that gets used to generate that. So it's to build the command, to build any programs you need to drive the REST API is very simple and straightforward. And there's capability in that UI to copy or download those snippets and then introduce them into your own code. So great enhancement for the REST API. Certainly the UI through a browser, even I can use it and get meaningful information out of GDPS, which is saying something, because a programmer I am not. Okay, so what else? Oh yeah, it also now supports GM and MGM 3 and 4 site, as well as Metro and XRC. So we've got good coverage from the RESTful API now as well, and it's been enhanced for LCP. I will add as well. A minor enhancement on the GUI. It's quite nice. You now have the ability to rather than have a WTOR, which just literally gave you that WTOR, which has the usual GDPS reply one of the options, but you haven't got the options to pick from when you just see the WTOR. You need the associated WTO as well. Well, we've now combined them together, so you see them in one place, which is a nice thing for us to have done, I think. And so it makes responding via the GUI much simpler than it was before. The hardware reserve support, this is the APAR number that introduced that, so that those reserves are preserved both across planned and unplanned hyperswap. As I say, it's not an opportunity to go and remove the pattern RNL and reintroduce reserves, etc. It's really a case of, for those exceptional conditions where you cannot get rid of a reserve, you can now tolerate them in your environment. Automatic unbox. Again, I've talked about this very briefly. There's an APAR PH 00014, which gives you an idea. It's been open for a while, but it's now fully available, and it will automatically clear that boxed condition during hyperswap prepare. Please note there is a ZOS APAR that's also required for that to work. The KEK failure management. So this is the new script that I mentioned. It gives you the ability to automatically trigger this KEK fail, KEK name script. As I say, if a system fails, we'll evaluate the current situation. And if we detect we can't talk to the BCPII for that KEK, then we will trigger that script. And that script can basically do whatever you can do in a script. There's no restrictions on what goes into that script. So I think that's brought us pretty much to the end of time. It's also brought me to the end of the presentation. I will be posting the slides right after I've finished. I forgot to do it last night. I do apologize to the question that's there. I don't see any questions, but I'm very open to the idea, Rui, if you want to open up the mics, and people can chip in and ask whatever questions they want. There is a slide here for additional information, which will take you to some links on the interweb. If you've got any questions, you can either contact me. I think my email address is on the front page, or gdps@us.ibm.com is a group mailbox, which comes to me, but also to Dave Peterson and other members of the GDPS team as you see fit. Please do not forget to submit your feedback. Over to you, Rui.
I'll take this one, Dave. But yeah, thanks. Excellent presentation. I think you've kind of done our closing statements there all by yourself, mate. Clearly done this before. So yeah, thanks for a great presentation. I think up next, Large Systems, we're back at midday with Mana Wally's second, part 2 of upgrading to ZOS 2.5. So we'll probably see you all back for that. Thanks again, Dave. Much appreciated. And we'll shut it down there.
It's being frozen on the screen. I don't know what's going on there.
Best ventriloquist I've ever seen, Dave. Take it, mate.
Very strange. All right. Cheers.
All right. Thanks all. Cheerio.